Student challenges Trump's knowledge of history. His answer leaves the professor speechless. Jenny Miller stared at her reflection in the Starbucks bathroom mirror, trying to straighten her name tag for the third time that morning. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed another late night of studying, but she managed a practiced smile. "Just 4 more hours," she whispered to herself. "Then history class." "Jenny," Maria's voice carried through the door. "Line's getting crazy out here." "Coming." She splashed some water on her face and hurried out. The morning rush was brutal, as always. Jenny moved on autopilot. Grande caramel macchiato. Venti cold brew. Mobile order for Steve. Her mind wandered to the Civil War letters she'd been transcribing for Professor Thompson's research project. "Earth to Jenny." Maria waved a hand in front of her face. "You're overfilling that cup, girl." "Sorry." Jenny grabbed a cloth, wiping up the spilled coffee. "Just thinking about those letters again." Maria rolled her eyes fondly. "You and your history obsession. Most people just take it to fulfill their requirements, you know." "Yeah, well, most people didn't grow up with these stories." Jenny started on another drink. "My great-great-grandfather died at Gettysburg, I know," Maria finished, grinning. "You've only told me like 1,000 times." The morning rush finally died down around 10. Jenny was cleaning the espresso machine when her phone buzzed. It was a group text from Professor Thompson. "Reminder. Former President Trump guest lecture today at 2 p.m. Attendance mandatory. No exceptions." "Oh, God," Jenny groaned. "I completely forgot about that." Maria peered over her shoulder at the message. "Girl, how could you forget? The whole campus has been talking about nothing else for weeks." Jenny shrugged, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. Maybe I was trying to forget, on purpose. The rest of her shift crawled by. During her break, Jenny pulled out her laptop and opened the folder of scanned Civil War letters she'd been working on. Her fingers traced the words on the screen. "My dearest Mary, the things I have seen here at Gettysburg cannot be unsaid. The screams of dying men, both blue and gray, haunt my dreams. But we fight because we must. Some things cannot be compromised." "Those letters again?" Maria had appeared behind her. "You need a hobby that doesn't involve dead people." Jenny closed the laptop with a sigh. "These aren't just dead people, Maria. This is our history. Real people died for what they believed in. And now, you get to hear what the former president thinks about it." Maria wiggled her eyebrows. "Try not to start any fights, okay?" Jenny forced a laugh, but her stomach churned. She'd seen clips of Trump's other university speeches. The way he talked about history, like it was all just deals and ratings, made her blood boil. After her shift, Jenny rushed back to her dorm to change. Her roommate Lisa was sprawled on her bed, scrolling through TikTok. "Have you seen this?" Lisa held up her phone, showing a video of protesters gathering outside the lecture hall. Jenny pulled on a clean sweater. "Great. That'll put him in a good mood." "You okay?" Lisa sat up, studying her face. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad." Jenny sat heavily on her bed. "You know how I feel about people misrepresenting history, and he always does it so, confidently. Like facts don't matter." Lisa threw a pillow at her. "Then don't say anything, just sit there, get your attendance credit, and come back. We can order pizza and watch bad reality television after." "Yeah." Jenny grabbed her backpack. "That's the plan." The campus was buzzing when Jenny stepped outside. Security checkpoints had been set up around the lecture hall, and students were queuing up to get through them. She spotted Maria waving from near the front of the line. "Saved you a spot," Maria called out. "Though I don't know why we're here so early. It's not like we're getting good seats anyway." Jenny joined her, fidgeting with the strap of her backpack. "I want to be able to hear properly." "Why? Planning to fact check him?" Maria laughed, then stopped when she saw Jenny's face. "Jenny. Number. Promise me you're not going to do anything stupid." "Of course not," Jenny said quickly. Too quickly. Maria grabbed her arm. "I'm serious. I know that look. That's the same look you had before you got into that fight with Professor Richards about Columbus Day. That was different. He was actually willing to listen to facts." The line inched forward. Security was thorough, checking bags and scanning everyone with metal detectors. Jenny could see news vans parked along the street, reporters doing stand-ups about the former president's controversial campus tour. Inside, the lecture hall was already half full. They found seats in the middle section, not too close, but not too far back. Jenny pulled out her notebook, more out of habit than any real intention to take notes. Students filtered in steadily. The tension in the room was palpable, a mix of excitement and apprehension. Jenny overheard snippets of conversations around her. "Did you see his speech at Princeton? My dad says he's going to announce another run. Can't believe they're making us attend this." Professor Thompson appeared at the podium, looking more nervous than Jenny had ever seen him. "If I could have everyone's attention, please. The former president will be arriving shortly. I want to remind everyone that this is an academic setting. We expect respectful behavior regardless of personal political views." Jenny's hands were already sweating. She wiped them on her jeans, trying to focus on breathing normally. Maria squeezed her arm reassuringly. "It'll be fine," Maria whispered. "Just 2 hours of your life. You can do this." The side door opened, and Secret Service agents filed in, taking positions around the room. A murmur went through the crowd. Jenny's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Then he walked in. The reaction was immediate. Some students stood and applauded. Others remained pointedly seated, arms crossed. Trump walked to the podium with his characteristic swagger, soaking in the attention like a sponge. "What a crowd," he began, grinning. "They told me college students wouldn't want to hear from me. Fake news, folks. Fake news." Jenny's pencil snapped in her hand. Maria shot her a warning look. The first 30 minutes weren't too bad. Trump mostly talked about his presidency, his usual mix of boasting and grievances. Jenny took deep breaths, reminding herself that she just needed to get through this. Then he started talking about history. "You know, people don't understand history anymore. They teach it all wrong in schools now. Take the Civil War, for example. Such a nasty thing. Didn't need to happen." Jenny's body went rigid. Maria's hand found hers, squeezing hard. "It was all about negotiation, folks. That's what I do. I negotiate. Could have worked everything out. Both sides had good people, very fine people." The pencil fragments in Jenny's hand dug into her palm. She could hear her great-great-grandfather's words in her head. Some things cannot be compromised. Andrew Jackson was very upset about it. Very upset. He said it shouldn't have happened. Smart man. Andrew Jackson. They don't talk about him enough anymore. Jenny's hand shot up before she could stop herself. She didn't even realize she had done it until she saw Professor Thompson looking at her with a mix of surprise and alarm. Maria hissed, "Jenny, no!" But it was too late. Trump had seen her hand. He paused, probably expecting a friendly question from a supporter. Yes, the young lady in the blue sweater. Jenny stood up, her legs shaking. 500 faces turned to look at her. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. But she could feel the weight of those Civil War letters in her backpack. The voices of the dead crying out for truth. Her mouth was dry as dust, but she forced the words out anyway. "That's not true, sir." The room went dead silent. Maria tugged at her sleeve, trying to pull her back down. But Jenny stood her ground. Trump's expression darkened slightly. "Excuse me?" Jenny swallowed hard, but when she spoke again, her voice was stronger. "I said that's not true, sir. You're wrong about the Civil War. People didn't die over something that could have been talked out over coffee." A few nervous laughs echoed through the lecture hall. Trump's expression shifted from surprise to amusement, then to something harder. "Young lady," he said, drawing out the words, "what's your name?" "Jenny Miller, sir." "Jenny Miller." He repeated it slowly, as if tasting the name. "And what makes you think you know more about the Civil War than me? I was president, you know. Had access to all the documents, all the secret files." Jenny's hands were trembling, but she reached into her backpack anyway. The folder of letters was right where she'd left it. "Because I have these," she said, holding up the folder. "Primary sources. Real letters from soldiers who fought and died. My great-great-grandfather wrote them from the battlefields." Professor Thompson stepped forward, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Perhaps we should move on to the next topic." No, Trump interrupted, waving him off. "This is interesting, very interesting. Let's hear what Miss Miller's great-great-grandfather had to say, since she thinks she knows so much about history." Some students were filming now. Jenny could see phones pointed at her from every direction. Maria was practically sliding under her seat with secondhand embarrassment. Jenny opened the folder with shaking hands. "This was written the night before Gettysburg," she said, her voice gaining strength as she read. "We fight not for glory or empire, but for the fundamental truth that all men are created equal. There can be no compromise on this point. No negotiation that leaves some men in chains while others walk free." She looked up from the letter. "That's what they were fighting for, Mr. President. Not some business deal gone wrong. Not something that could have been settled with better negotiation. They were fighting for human dignity, for freedom." Trump's face had reddened slightly. "Look, those are very nice words. Very nice. But you're young. You don't understand how the world works. In business." "This wasn't business," Jenny interrupted, surprising herself with her own boldness. "You mentioned Andrew Jackson earlier. You said he was upset about the Civil War. But Andrew Jackson died in 1845, 16 years before the Civil War even started." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Trump's face darkened further. "That's typical liberal professor talk," he said, pointing at her accusingly. "They fill your heads with these dates, these so-called facts." "They're not so-called facts," Jenny said. Her voice was shaking now, but with anger rather than fear. "They're just facts. Andrew Jackson died in 1845. The Civil War started in 1861. That's not liberal or conservative. It's just what happened." The tension in the room was electric. Secret Service agents had shifted their positions slightly, moving closer to the podium. Professor Thompson looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "You want to talk about dates?" Trump's voice had taken on that combative tone his supporters loved. "Let me tell you about dates. Nobody knows more about dates than me. I have the best dates." A few people laughed nervously, but most of the room remained silent, watching the exchange like a tennis match. "Okay," Jenny said, pulling her laptop out. "Let's talk about dates." She opened her research folder. "Would you like to discuss the Missouri Compromise of 1820? The Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831? The Dred Scott decision of 1857? Which specific historical event do you think could have been resolved through negotiation?" Trump stared at her for a long moment. The room held its breath. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "You know what? I can see what they've done to you here. These liberal universities, they're not teaching history anymore. They're teaching activism. When I was president—" "Sir," Jenny cut in, her voice quiet but clear, "you still haven't answered my question about which specific aspects of the Civil War you believe could have been negotiated." The room was so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning humming. Trump's face had turned an alarming shade of red. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For a moment, just a moment, Jenny thought she saw something like uncertainty flash across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual bravado. "You want to debate history?" he said suddenly. "Fine. Let's debate history, right here, right now." The atmosphere in the lecture hall crackled with tension. Security personnel in dark suits had already started moving toward Jenny, their earpieces gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But Trump raised his hand, stopping them with a gesture. His face had that familiar red tinge, but his eyes were calculating. "You know what?" he said, leaning into the microphone. "I like this. Everyone says college students are too scared to speak up these days. Too worried about being politically correct." He paused for effect. "So the little history major thinks she knows more than a president? More than someone who's actually made history?" Professor Thompson cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. President, perhaps we should—" No, Trump interrupted. "This is important, very important. The people need to see what's happening in our universities." He turned back to Jenny. "You've got quite an attitude, young lady. Quite an attitude. But let's see if you can back it up." Jenny's hands were trembling so badly she had to grip the desk to steady them. Around her, students were frozen in their seats, phones still recording. Maria tugged desperately at her sleeve. "Jenny, please," she whispered urgently. "Don't do this. He's trying to trap you. He does this all the time." 2 rows behind them, someone muttered, "Sit down. You're embarrassing yourself." But another voice whispered, "No, keep going." Trump was still talking, his voice filling the hall. "You know, it's funny. They tell me all the time, sir, the universities are indoctrinating our youth. And here we have proof. This young lady, what was your name again? Jenny Miller, she repeated, her voice somehow steady despite her racing heart. Jenny Miller thinks she can lecture a president about history. He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Tell me, Miss Miller, where did you get your education? CNN? MSNBC? Something inside Jenny snapped. She thought of her mother, who'd spent 20 years teaching history at Lincoln High School, staying late every day to help students understand why the past mattered. Who'd always told her, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Columbia University, sir, she answered clearly. And before that, public school in Ohio, where my mom teaches history. She always says that history isn't just about memorizing dates, it's about understanding human nature and learning from our mistakes. A few scattered claps echoed through the hall, quickly silenced by glares from the Secret Service agents. Trump's smile widened, but his eyes narrowed. Ohio, that explains a lot. You know, I won Ohio twice, would have won it a third time if… Sir, Jenny interrupted, her voice shaking slightly. What does that have to do with the Civil War? The room went deadly quiet. Even the Secret Service agents seemed to hold their breath. No one interrupted Trump. Everyone knew that. He stared at her for a long moment, then suddenly barked out a laugh. You've got nerve, I'll give you that. A lot of nerve. He loosened his tie slightly. Okay, Miss Ohio. You want to talk about the Civil War? Let's talk about the Civil War. Right here, right now. A little history debate. Professor Thompson stepped forward again, looking pale. Mr. President, this isn't part of the scheduled program. The schedule just changed, Trump announced. He spread his arms wide, playing to the cameras that were undoubtedly already streaming this live across the internet. Unless Miss Miller is afraid to defend her liberal talking points. The challenge hung in the air. Jenny felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. Maria was still clutching her arm, whispering desperately, Don't do it, girl. It's not worth it. This is exactly what he wants. Jenny closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about the letters in her bag, about her great-great-grandfather dying at Gettysburg, about her mother, who always said that silence in the face of misinformation was the same as endorsing it. She opened her eyes and stood up straighter. I accept your challenge, Mr. President. The room erupted in a mixture of gasps, cheers, and groans. Trump's eyebrows shot up clearly. He hadn't expected her to accept. Well, he said, adjusting his tie again. This should be interesting. Very interesting. Why don't you come down here, Miss Miller? Let's give these students a real education. Jenny's legs felt like they were made of jelly as she gathered her materials. Maria grabbed her arm one last time. Jenny, please, she pleaded. This is going to be all over the internet. They're going to destroy you on social media. Your mom could lose her job. Jenny hugged her friend quickly. Some things are worth the risk, she whispered. As she made her way down the steps toward the podium, she could hear people whispering, Is she crazy? This is amazing. Someone needs to stand up to him. She's going to regret this. Professor Thompson met her halfway down the aisle, his face a mask of concern. Miss Miller, he said quietly, you don't have to do this. We can end the lecture now. Jenny smiled weakly. Yes, I do have to do this, Professor. Because if we don't stand up for historical truth, who will? He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. Be careful, he murmured. He's not interested. In fact, she's interested in putting on a show. I know, Jenny replied. But maybe that's exactly why someone needs to challenge him. She continued down the steps, her footsteps echoing in the now silent hall. Trump watched her approach, that same calculating look in his eyes. As she reached the podium area, he gestured to one of his aides, who quickly set up a second microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Trump announced, his voice booming through the speakers. You're about to witness something special. Very special. A debate about American history between a former president of the United States and, he paused, smirking slightly, a college student who thinks she knows better. Jenny took her position at the second microphone, setting her materials on the small table someone had hastily provided. Her hands were still shaking, but her voice was steady as she responded. No, Mr. President, this isn't about who knows better. It's about facts versus fiction, truth versus mythology. And sometimes, the truth isn't what we want it to be. But that doesn't make it any less true. A low ooh rippled through the crowd. Trump's smirk faltered for just a moment, then returned full force. "Well then, Miss Miller," he said, emphasizing her name with a hint of mockery, "let's see what kind of truth they're teaching in our universities these days. Starting with your confused ideas about Andrew Jackson and the Civil War." Jenny took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice again. "If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything." The tension in the room was unbearable, as Trump adjusted his microphone, savoring the moment like a seasoned performer. "You know what's wrong with history education today?" he began, pacing slightly. "They focus on all the negative things. Very negative. They don't teach about the great deals, the amazing negotiations that built this country." Jenny gripped her microphone stand. "Actually, sir, that's not—" "Let me finish," Trump interrupted, holding up his hand. "Andrew Jackson, great president, fantastic president that knew how to make deals. He would have stopped the Civil War, would have sat everyone down, worked it out. But the politicians, they didn't want that. Bad politicians." Jenny took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. "Mr. President, I need to correct something. Andrew Jackson died in 1845. The Civil War started in 1861. That's 16 years. You keep saying that," Trump cut in, his face reddening. "But what you don't understand is that Jackson had the right attitude, the right mindset. He was a tough guy, very tough. Like me." From the corner of her eye, Jenny could see Professor Thompson making frantic, wrap-it-up gestures. But she couldn't stop now. "Sir, with all due respect, what exactly do you think could have been negotiated?" She pulled out one of the letters from her folder. "Because according to this letter, from a slave named William Still—" "Look, nobody was happy about slavery," Trump interrupted again, his voice rising. "Nobody. But there were very fine people on both sides. Very fine people." A collective gasp went through the room. Jenny's hand started shaking again, but this time with anger. "Fine people on both sides?" she repeated, her voice quivering. "Mr. President, I'd like to read you something." She pulled out another document, this one protected in a clear plastic sleeve. "This is a bill of sale from 1858. It lists the price of a 12-year-old girl named Sarah. They sold her for $400, separated her from her mother and 3 younger siblings." She looked up at Trump. "Which side of that transaction had the very fine people, sir?" Trump's face had turned an even deeper shade of red. "Now, listen here, young lady." "No, you listen," Jenny said, surprising herself with her firmness. "You can't negotiate human rights. You can't compromise on human dignity. That's what the Civil War was about. Not business, not deals, not states' rights. It was about whether human beings could own other human beings." The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Trump straightened his tie, clearly thrown off his rhythm. "You know what your problem is?" he said finally. "You're too emotional about this. History is history. It's done. We need to move on, make America great again." "History isn't just done," Jenny countered. "It echoes. It shapes us. When we misunderstand it, or worse, when we deliberately misrepresent it, we risk repeating the worst parts of it." A few students started clapping but quickly stopped when the Secret Service agents turned to look at them. Trump shifted tactics. "Let me tell you something about leadership," he began, falling back on familiar territory. "When I was president—" "Sir," Jenny interrupted, "we're not discussing your presidency. We're discussing your claim that the Civil War could have been prevented through negotiation. I'd like to focus on that specific point." The former president's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being challenged this directly, especially not by a college student. She could see him calculating his next move. "You liberals," he started, jabbing his finger in her direction. "You're always trying to divide people, always trying to make everyone feel guilty about history. I've done more for historical education than anyone. Anyone!" Jenny stood her ground. "This isn't about liberal or conservative, sir. It's about accuracy. Facts. Would you like to look at the primary sources together?" She gestured to her materials. "I have letters from soldiers on both sides, contemporary newspaper accounts, official documents." "I don't need to look at your papers," Trump scoffed. "I know more about history than most historians. People tell me all the time, 'Sir, Your knowledge of history is incredible." From the back of the room, someone shouted, "Tell her, Mr. President!" But Jenny wasn't backing down. She pulled out another document. "Then let's talk about Fort Sumter, about the actual event that started the Civil War. Would you agree that the Confederate forces fired the first shots?" Trump waved his hand dismissively. "Fort Sumter? Fort Sumter. Everyone always talks about Fort Sumter. But what about the economic issues? What about states' rights?" "States' rights? To do what, specifically?" Jenny pressed. She could feel her heart pounding, but her voice remained steady. "Because if you read the Confederate States' own declarations of secession, which I have right here, they make it very clear what right they were fighting for." She held up another document. Mississippi's declaration states, and I quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." The room had grown so quiet you could hear papers rustling as Jenny shuffled her documents. Trump's face had taken on a peculiar expression, a mixture of anger and something else. "Uncertainty?" "Young lady," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you clearly think you know everything. But let me tell you something about power. About how the real world works." "No, sir," Jenny interrupted, her voice equally quiet but firm. "Let me tell you something about power." She pulled out one final document from her folder. "This is a letter written by my great-great-grandfather the night before he died at Gettysburg. Would you like to hear what he said about power?" The former president stared at her for a long moment. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then Trump smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just decided to stop playing nice. "You know what?" he said, turning to address the crowd. "This is exactly what's wrong with our education system. This young lady, this very misguided young lady, she's been brainwashed by her liberal professors. She's memorized a bunch of dates and quotes, but she doesn't understand how the world really works." He turned back to Jenny, his eyes glinting. "So let's make this interesting. You want to debate history? Let's really debate it. Right here, right now. No notes, no prepared speeches. Just your supposed knowledge against my real-world experience." The challenge hung in the air. Jenny could feel Maria's eyes on her from the audience, could practically hear her friend mentally screaming at her to back down. But she thought about all the times she'd sat quietly while people twisted history to serve their own purposes. About all the times she'd watched politicians use historical ignorance as a weapon. About her mother, who taught her that knowledge without courage was useless. Jenny met Trump's gaze steadily. "I accept your challenge, Mr. President." And with those 4 words, she knew there was no turning back. It wasn't pretty. For 20 minutes, they went back and forth. Jenny's voice cracked as she talked about the slaves who died dreaming of freedom. Trump kept interrupting her, talking about his television ratings and how Lincoln would have loved his tweets. Then Trump said something that made Jenny's blood boil. He claimed the slaves were actually happy and had good relationships with their masters. Jenny pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking so bad she could barely hold it. "I want to read you something," she said. It was a slave narrative she'd saved for a class project. Just 3 sentences about a mother watching her children being sold away. Halfway through reading it, Jenny started crying. She couldn't help it. But she kept reading, her voice getting stronger with each word. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Trump tried to laugh it off, but his face had gone pale. He muttered something about fake news and liberal professors, but everyone could see he was rattled. The dean ended the lecture early. As Jenny walked out, students she'd never met hugged her. Others just nodded, some with tears in their eyes. That night her mom called. She'd seen the video. It was already all over the internet. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Do you know what you've done?" Jenny looked at her phone. Death threats were pouring in. But so were messages from people thanking her, including one from a history teacher in Texas who said his whole class had watched the video and given her a standing ovation. "Yeah, Mom," Jenny said, wiping her eyes. "I know exactly what I did. I told the truth." The next morning as Jenny walked to class, a freshman she'd never met stopped her. "My grandpa was in the Holocaust," the girl said quietly. "Thank you for not letting them rewrite history." Jenny just nodded. Her throat was too tight to speak. Sometimes the biggest moments in life aren't planned. They just come at you, and you have to decide. stay quiet or stand up. Jenny had made her choice. And even with all the chaos it caused, she knew she'd do it again in a heartbeat. The end.